I am absolutely delighted to have the chance to talk to you today. And I think what I'd like to talk about is carrying on just the next step along from what Jane was talking about in her presentation just now. Most inequalities, when you talk about inequalities of well-being, inequalities of health, they're often talking about socio-economic inequalities. However, there are other inequalities by minority groups, so by ethnicity, for instance. There is an issue around social justice that Jane was talking about. So, for instance, in the Equalities Act 2010, there are a number of protected groups. And in addition to doing my systematic reviewing work, I also have been working in sexual orientation and gender identity, health and well-being. So, what about sexual orientation and inequalities? Are there any? Do we know anything about them? Well, actually, once you start to look, there are some very distinctive health inequalities that we've found so far. So for sexual minority women, would you expect it? What we have found is that there's higher rates of asthma. We have absolutely no idea why there are higher rates of asthma, but that's what we have found. When you put all the literature together in a systematic review, you find higher rates. Also, slightly less unexpected is higher rates of mental health difficulties, higher rates of suicide attempts, higher rates of eating disorders, higher rates of self-harm. So, you know, some of these are starting to become well-being indicators. And so, for instance, the Office for National Statistics, through Dawn Snape, who now works there, who was involved with the well-being group at the start, she has been looking at some of the well-being indicators that they have measured and analysing those by sexual orientation and finding lower well-being by sexual minorities. So, what's the next step? Well, the Government Equalities Office has very recently conducted a very large survey around sexual minority and gender identity minority groups and their experience of a wide variety of different experiences of healthcare, education, and so on and so forth. So they ran this survey. It was mostly an online survey, and they thought they'd get a reasonable sample. The sample they actually got was 100,000. You know, that's an enormous sample. 100,000 people completed that survey. And as you can imagine, it's got some really, really interesting results. Some of it, a lot of it's quantitative, some of it's qualitative. But it's certainly worth looking at. It's available on the government website. And it's my specialist areas around healthcare, and some of the results around experience of healthcare are really rather telling. There's a lot of discrimination still. Most discrimination is around something called heteronormativity. So that's expecting people to be heterosexual when they're not. There's just a presumption that everybody who comes through the door is going to be heterosexual. So, to give you an example, say you're going for a cervical smear, and the smear nurse has been asked to inquire of everybody having a smear about their sexual health. So they say, are you having sex? And you might say yes. So, are you having contraception? Are you taking contraception? No. So, are you trying for baby? No. And at that point, the smear nurse goes, this doesn't make sense. And that's the example of heteronormity. It's that they just assume that you're going to be having heterosexual sex. They didn't ask me, are you having heterosexual sex? They just asked me whether I'm having sex. And, you know, it's a slight change in language, but it makes an awful lot of difference. So another reason why this government survey had so many respondents is because there has been considerable amount of invisibility. One of the biggest health inequalities is being missed out. So, I'll give you an example. This measuring inequalities, just picked it up here. It's, I need my glasses for this. Right, on page 10. So, it's about measuring inequalities, a how-to guide. So, what to control for? Standard tests which you can determine whether well-being and well-being inequalities are being different between groups or have changed significantly over time. So, try to control for health and disability, relationship status, economic activity, income, age, gender, ethnicity, religion, qualifications, children, blah, 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 blah. There's nothing in there about sexual orientation or gender identity. Now, why is that? Now, I'm quite sure it's nothing to do with homophobia. I think what the issue is that it's so unusual to see information by sexual orientation. And it's just being missed out. There are standardized measures, validated measures of ethnicity and all kinds of these other ways of measuring different groups. There is also now a standardized, validated measure done by the Office for National Statistics around sexual orientation. So it can be done, but it's not being done. So when they ask, say, health professionals, why are you not asking about sexual orientation? They're going, oh, I don't like to, it's embarrassing. It may cause offence. But that's what people were talking about when they were measuring ethnicity about 10 years ago. And yes, it was very difficult at first, and some people thought people were being racist. But gradually, over the time, it's become normalised and very usual now to tick some boxes about ethnicity and stuff like that. Now, you can tick some boxes about sexual orientation as well. And it's starting to come in, and that is very, very welcome because it increases our visibility. Unfortunately for gender identity, we don't have a validated measure yet. I'm sure it will come in soon, but that's what we need. And gender identity issues are sort of lagging behind a little bit because there's lack of validated measure. So it's very important, if you can possibly do it, to include some kind of measure of sexual orientation in your evaluations. You won't cause offence, people will be cheering because people are being asked, and most people want to be asked. At the moment there's quite a lot of prefer not to says in the tick box exercises, but that will gradually disappear over time as it becomes more normal, more usual to actually fill in these boxes. And this is about social justice, about being counted, being part of a community. Now, the other issue really is that community well-being, when you say community, you sort of tend to think of a geographical community. Now, if you're a part of a minority group, it doesn't quite work like that. So, say I might be part of a walking group, and that covers 3 counties. It's not part of my local area at all. And I might not wish to take part in a walking group from the local village because actually the people I want to socialise are dotted around all over the place. And it's still part of a community, but because it's geographically very spread, it means it's quite difficult to get funding, for instance. So an awful lot of funding at the moment, grants and things are just related to your local geography. And so it's proving to be very difficult to actually find funding for a walking group, which seems bizarre. So maybe you've got an intervention that you want to enhance people's well-being with. There is a government, what's it called, inquiry at the moment. The Women Inequalities Office are looking at sexual orientation and gender identity and health and well-being. And one of the questions in that government inquiry are what interventions work in sexual minority people. Now, I'm in the middle of doing a systematic review of interventions applicable to sexual minority people, and there is practically nothing at all. I think we've got one case study on smoking prevention, because, like, for instance, smoking prevention, why should we assume that the standard smoking prevention interventions work for sexual minority people? We know high rates of smoking exist, but are they actually going to turn up for a standardised thing where they feel a little bit isolated, a bit of out of place? They probably won't. So we've got something on smoking prevention, but only a case series, no trial. There's something on vaccination for hepatitis B. I think there's something on counselling, but only one particular thing. There's very, very little information on health inequalities interventions by sexual orientation, and even less by gender identity. So, in conclusion, I think it's important to think about not just socio-economic differences in well-being, but I've been talking about sexual minorities and gender identity. There are also refugees, there's migrants, travellers, a wide variety of other different minority groups, and their experiences of well-being in society can be very different as well. So I think it's important to think about marginalised groups and how they are being brought along by the well-being agenda, and what can be done to actually enhance that. Thank you very much.